It starts with a spark that can change everything. But ideas don't come from nothing. They come from out there. Data and inspiration floating for the taking. And with the Internet of Things connecting us more than ever, we're committed to co-create a better tomorrow. The future is open to suggestions. This is social innovation. Hitachi, inspire the next.
Jason, I'd like to start with you. You wrote a very interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal recently.
It wasn't The Economist, I'm sorry.
That's fine, that's fine. We don't know our direct competitors, so it's okay. You made a very interesting case on why you believe that market forces will matter more than policy when it comes to our sustainable future and the future of America's energy sector. Why don't you lay out some of the arguments?
Yeah, so I want to be clear about what I was saying and not saying. So I was specifically talking about what I thought the implications would be of the deregulatory agenda that the Trump administration has announced now, particularly the executive order that President Trump signed at the Environmental Protection Agency with a backdrop of coal miners telling them that they were going back to work. And I tried to point out the way in which rolling back this environmental agenda, largely Obama-era regulations, would, in many respects, not all respects, have, I think, minimal impact on what the outlook is for the U.S. energy sector and the emissions trajectory in some of the key places. So we're going to roll back. There's an intention to ease the Clean Power Plan or remove the Clean Power Plan. Obviously, there's a litigation process to determine whether that happens. But given the market outlook, the very low price of natural gas in particular, and the falling cost of renewables, we're going to come pretty close, if not all the way, to meeting the targets in the Clean Power Plan, even without the Clean Power Plan. If you redo the 5-year leasing plan and open the offshore to drilling, especially in the Arctic off Alaska, with $50 oil, Nick can tell me this is right, I don't think a lot of companies are going to go and start exploring in the Arctic again. You can lift the moratorium of coal leasing on federal land. There are huge market forces that have caused the decline of U.S. coal from 50 to 30% of our electricity sector, and those are not going away, and we're not bringing coal back, even if you get rid of all of these regulations. This administration has been very supportive, which I wasn't sure in the beginning given some of the protectionist rhetoric about U.S. exports, particularly LNG exports, but with a glutted, oversupplied gas market, you're going to struggle to see new investments in LNG, whether we accelerate permitting or not. So that's the effect of the deregulatory agenda we see. There are some things that do, I think, have more consequence, like if we were to ease fuel economy standards next year. And I want to be clear that that's not the same as the long-term tools that are needed to achieve anything close to the kind of commitments on 2 degrees warming that people committed to in Paris. If we're serious about transitioning to a clean energy future, if we're serious about addressing the problem of global climate change, this doesn't happen because of market forces alone. Cheap natural gas can help, and falling renewable costs help, and other things, but you ultimately need government. That's government's job, is to internalize social costs, to take the cost of CO2 that we put in the air and turn that into policy through a carbon price or something else. That will be necessary to kind of get to where we need to be eventually. But I was speaking specifically about what I think the effects will be of Trump's deregulatory agenda in that executive order he signed.
So, Nick, well, ExxonMobil sort of famously and sort of somewhat counterintuitively to many American liberals, in the American sense of the word, not the British sense of the word, has actually come out quite forcefully in favor of the Paris Accord. Do you think that, I'm just basically the same question as I asked Jason, do you think that market forces really matter much more than whatever the current administration, or indeed any future administration, will do on the policy front to assure that certain sustainability targets or sustainability dreams are reached?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having us today. I agree with a lot of what Jason said and how he spelled it out in his Wall Street Journal piece. And the reason you couldn't do it for The Economist is it wouldn't be a signed byline, so you can't do that. And I'd reiterate just the importance of market factors here for us to consider. You know, it's not that far west of here, for example, that the shale revolution has taken place, increasing the abundance of natural gas in the United States. And if you look at the emissions profile, say the GHG emissions profile of the United States over the last few years, it's actually been an encouraging story, and that's been in part because of technology and markets driving changes in the energy mix that were really independent of policy. And so I think that's important for us to keep in mind, that as important as policy is, and there's a lot of talk obviously about Paris and what that means and the Trump administration's position, and we can talk more about that. We should also remember just the important role of technology and markets in shaping these things, in shaping the decisions that consumers are making, not just in the United States and North America, but around the world. That doesn't mean that policy isn't important. You mentioned the position that our company has taken. We have been supportive of the Paris Agreement. Let me just take a second to explain why we've been supportive, maybe somewhat counterintuitively, but not really. The issue of GHG emissions, it is a global issue, obviously. It's a global commons problem, right? To the extent that emissions that happen at one point source matter for everybody around the world. And the important wrinkle to Paris was that it really was having all these nations coming together and making these, what they call nationally determined contributions. So everyone committing, understanding that there would be differentiated and variable approaches that different countries might take, but that all countries were going to be doing that. Now, obviously, things are in flux a little bit with the Trump administration's decision, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a broad recognition about the need to address this issue and to address it globally, and that was really what was most attractive about the Paris approach and why we were supportive of it.
Susan, do you think that the market forces are enough? Because we've heard now that the market forces are going to do more than policy in order to advance towards these goals. Are market forces enough, or do we need something on top of these market forces?
I do think that, as has been articulated here, markets play a key role. Markets are what brings solutions to scale of something that is really a grand challenge of our society. But if you look at the 3 E's of sustainability, economy, ecology, and equity, of those 3's, we tend to value more what we sell, i.e. the economy, and less on sort of the ecological services that are given to us for free, as well as an equity issue, which is, of course, one of the social drivers that we have here. So I think that's where the policy framework is so important, not just the Paris Agreement, which gives you that policy agreement on a global scope, but other policies and regulatory things that keep us in check to make sure that we have the 3 E's. And the 3 E's in solving those 3 E's and paying attention to those 3 E's requires not just the market-based approach, but some sort of policy arrangement as well.
What specifically on the other 2 E's? Because on the economy, we can say that markets account for a lion's share of that third of the sustainability circle. The other 2/3, what important policies do you think that we need in order to reach these goals? What would you say are one for each of the other 2, one for equity, one for
on ecosystems and ecology, it would be basically, one would be what do we do with green infrastructure? Okay, and do we value enough the ability to replenish our ecosystems in terms of the mangroves that we've destroyed, or the looking at our fisheries? How do we make sure that the food sources are there on our land? The balance of taking land use out of forests, which have taken a huge carbon uptake, and putting it in agriculture, making that as efficient as possible. So there's a lot of sort of ecosystem services that we take for granted that are being degraded. And so and policies kind of help set the framework to put investment, if you will, usually public investment, into restoring some of those ecosystem services. Equity is a big issue. There are the haves and the haves not, and the developing countries certainly would like to achieve a certain level of Western world lifestyle. But does it have to be the same? And so equity in terms of access to information. We talk about the data revolution. What's the policy around sort of that free and open exchange of data so that all in the world can have equal access to it? So that would be a policy as well.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's a little dangerous, actually, some of the rhetoric that we've heard some of the responses to the announcements, the response to what this administration has said it's going to do in terms of rolling back a bunch of environmental regulations, and what you hear often is people saying it doesn't matter because it's going to happen anyway. It's unstoppable. The clean energy transition is unstoppable because the cost of renewables, the cost of batteries, electric vehicles is coming down so quickly. It is very encouraging, the fact that over the last 6 or 7 years, solar costs have fallen 85%, wind costs 40%. Electric vehicles are becoming increasingly competitive with gasoline vehicles. But I don't believe that you internalize a social cost like global greenhouse gas emissions, and that the most economic way to power the planet is a zero carbon way. So if you're serious about meeting the kind of targets that people committed to in Paris, you need policy to become much stronger. That's not the trajectory that we're on today. We should remember that markets and technology are really important, but they cut in both directions. So the greatest technological innovation in the energy sector in the last 20 years has been the shale revolution. That's given us cheap gas. That's helped substitute for coal. It's also causing nuclear plants, which are zero carbon, to shut down increasingly because they can't compete with cheap gas. It's also giving us this year a 1 million barrel a day increase in global oil supply. So I was at the Schlumberger Research Lab in Cambridge, England, about a month ago, and what that company is doing, as I'm sure yours too, to figure out how to use big data and sensors and get much, much better at how they can extract oil from 3 miles below sea level is extraordinary. So energy technology is going to help extract hydrocarbons more economically, as well as bring down the cost of clean energy. And so to believe that the world's just going to decarbonize on its own without policy, you would need to think that if tomorrow, hypothetically, we discover climate change actually is a hoax, the world would still transition away from hydrocarbons because it's the cheapest thing to do. I don't think that's the case, and I don't think we see evidence of that, which is why I think policy, through a carbon price, ideally, needs to internalize those costs.
Nick, so we've talking about this sort of tension and the market forces moving sometimes in different directions, technology and market forces sometimes moving in opposite directions even. Are the market forces in the market for oil is a global one, but you also have lots of local markets, or regional markets for oil and for other resources. Are the market forces in the United States moving in the same direction as those market forces in the developing world, for instance? And what does the movement of market forces in the developing world, and we have one huge movement is a lot more people wanting to get out of poverty, wanting to more development, and that typically will mean greater energy use, greater resource use per capita. How are those forces moving? Are they moving in parallel? Are they moving in opposite directions? And what is ExxonMobil doing in order to manage those movements?
So you actually framed that very helpfully. That one of the things that we talk about is that there's a sort of a dual challenge that the world faces. You still have enormous numbers of people, hundreds of millions, billions of people around the world without access to affordable and reliable sources of energy. You have more than 1 billion people who don't have access to electricity. You have more than 2 billion people who don't have access to clean forms of cooking, for example, in their homes. So, and they have a very understandable interest in enjoying at least something approximating the living standards that the developed world has. And that necessitates an increase in energy use and consumption. At the same time, as Jason was helpfully pointing out, over a longer period of time, you need policies in place that address and I hope we get a chance to talk about this, technologies in place that meaningfully address the emissions that are the result of the use of modern forms of energy. What's interesting about markets in the developing world, the United States actually enjoys, from a resource extraction and development standpoint, a number of advantages that don't exist in other parts of the world, including subsurface mineral rights and a property rights system and a market system that enables the orderly development and the efficient extraction of resources in the United States. Almost every other country around the world doesn't have that. So one of the interesting things is you have countries that are interested in what's happened in the United States with the shale revolution. And lots of representatives from countries come to the United States and they say, what's happened in West Texas or what's happened in the Marcellus, and how can we do that? Because they're interested in natural gas, especially as a relatively clean source of electrification for their countries. A lot of these countries don't have the system of property rights where they can take advantage of that, where they can see the rapid scaling that we've seen in terms of the development of this industry. So there are differences there. What you are seeing is increasing interest, and part of this is an outgrowth of Paris, regardless of what the Trump administration has elected to do, in understanding that the energy mix, which is evolving and has always evolved and is going to continue to evolve, will do so in response to technological developments, but then also policies that are put in place. And I think the relevant question is, what kinds of policies do you want in place that ensure the most efficient use of energy and the cleanest use of energy over time, while also satisfying the demand, the increasing demand that there's going to be for energy use around the world?
So I have one follow-up question to that, and that's, to what extent, if any, I mean, you said that the American energy market is relatively peculiar by global standards. To what extent are policy decisions outside of the United States, in other countries, to what extent do they have an effect on what actually happens within the borders of the United States when it comes to energy market? Is there some sort of a transmission mechanism from foreign policy decisions into domestic American goings on?
There certainly can be, in terms of, and Jason can talk a lot about this. I mean, his team at Columbia spends a lot of time studying the global markets for all energy goods and services. But on the demand side, policy, especially in the developing world especially, policy it will determine, to a large extent, the mix of, will countries be using coal, and if they're using coal, will they use their own domestic coal resources if they have them, or will they be importing coal? Will there be infrastructure that will be developed, and a lot of that is a policy question, to bring in, say, LNG, liquefied natural gas, from around the world, and you increasingly see a sort of globalized natural gas market. On the renewables front, policy will drive the extent to which solar PV or wind is developed in different countries. So, and that will obviously have effect on companies that are in this space and that are developing technologies that can be used around the world. So policy is hugely important, especially when we're talking about the question of emissions in places like China and India, because obviously a lot of what happens in the United States or in Europe, where you have sort of mature energy markets, that matters. But if you look at the growth regions, and we're talking East Asia, and we're talking South Asia, and to some extent Africa and Latin America, that's really where, when we're talking about sustainability issues, say in the climate sense, that's where a lot of the story is going to be written. So policy in these countries and in these regions is extremely important.
Jason, before going to...
No, but I think policy in a lot of countries matters a lot. I mean, the most obvious example today is probably the fact that from start to end of 2017, U.S. oil production will be up 1 million barrels a day, partly due to technology improvements and also due to policy, OPEC policy, and the fact that OPEC's, along with Russia's renewed interest in trying to manage markets, is helping that U.S. dramatically increase oil production. But other things too. I mean, you look at the deep investment that China in particular has made in building its solar capability and its solar industry. That's helped to collapse the price of solar around the world, and that has made solar more economic in the U.S. It's challenged U.S. solar manufacturers, but in terms of the uptake because of the prices, that's happened. The U.S. is soon going to be a net exporter of natural gas, and by the end of the decade, one of the largest in the world, and that's because of opportunities in other countries to put policies in place that create the demand for that natural gas. But perhaps the most important one, I think, in terms of what other countries mean for the U.S., is the Paris Agreement and the problem of global climate change. I mean, carbon and greenhouse gas emissions in particular suffer from the tragedy of the commons problem and a collective action problem because it's the most global pollutant. It doesn't, in terms of the impact on climate change, it has the same effect whether it comes from the US or China or somewhere else. So in order to give policymakers in any one country, including the US, I think the confidence to increasingly take more ambitious measures to reduce emissions, you need to see that other countries are doing it too. Otherwise, you're not willing to impose that cost on yourself. So seeing that that was the idea behind the Paris Agreement with individually determined voluntary contributions, and you would ratchet up the ambition over time when you saw we were all doing this together. Unfortunately, the US is not part of that now. I think that's critically important.
So in some of the past, or some of the previous panels, we heard a fair amount of optimism from the panelists. Susan, I would like to ask you as a scholar of the climate, what's your most optimistic, realistic scenario for what's going to happen to temperatures? Not the doomsday scenarios. What's the best that we can hope for, given what we've talked about, the fact that a lot of the developing world still wants more energy, still wants and probably will use more resources. What's the most benign scenario that you can think of?
Well, I think a lot depends on what comes to fruition in terms of some of the very exciting research that's going on. And,
right.
and you've already heard in the first couple of panels some of the great research that's coming into application. And, you know, electricity is only part of the problem that we're talking about. Transportation fuels, particularly heavy transportation, heavy fuels, aviation fuels, and we heard some insights there. But lots of work being done on biofuels, whether you're looking at research of biofuels of manipulating a molecule that creates the appropriate fuel, or whether you're taking a already existing molecule or product like marine algae, an ecosystem, and then looking at all of the co-products. I mean, a lot of the value of petroleum, of course, is the fact that there's a lot of co-products associated with it. It's not just the electricity, it's the transportation fuels, as well as the hundreds of products that use petrochemicals. This molecule is so efficient as an organic feedstock. And so, but looking at other ways to get that organic feedstock is certainly a tremendous sort of research enterprise right now, looking at it. Getting the money into that basic research to jumpstart it, and finding the people who are going to invest in it long term to bring it to fruition is really the time scale that is unknown at this point. There are certainly solutions out there, okay, and bringing those solutions to scale is what will determine what's the optimistic number that we're going to get to. No matter what you do, there's a synergy between adaptation and mitigation issues. And the developing world may not choose the same pathway as the developed world in their choices of transportation or what their policies are going to be. And so knowing what India or China or Africa is going to actually be able to do, I mean, I've been driving in India. It's not much fun. I can't imagine more cars in India or China.
I live in Sao Paulo.
Oh, okay.
And don't have a car.
They may choose an entirely different clean mass transit sort of system that would be better suited to them. So, and still attain the living standards that the developed world has. So, adaptation, though, is also part of this situation. We will have to adapt. Our communities will have to adapt. Our cities will have to adapt. There's a certain amount of warming already built into that, unless you begin to take, and it comes to fruition, technologies like carbon sequestration. The ability, and again, that's another research area. ExxonMobil's doing some good work on carbon sequestration, as well as biofuels, and bringing them to scale, and in a way that does not take more carbon. Yeah. Okay, so it's hard to answer your question right now as to what's that final number going to be. I can be pretty optimistic. I generally am optimistic. But it's going to take an adaptation. And the reason why mitigation is so important to adaptation is that adaptation is going to be very costly if you don't know what's the possibilities and the probabilities of success of some of these new fuel standards, what biofuels, what carbon sequestration, what you can do. And so I think a lot of research really needs to be done in terms of understanding the planet and creating those information systems for cities to be taking a look at how do I use green infrastructure. We're talking a lot about infrastructure in investment in infrastructure in this country. It should not just be gray infrastructure, hardened infrastructure, but we've lost a lot of our carbon capture of our natural environment just by the bridges, the lands, the roads that we've built. How do cities and other communities bring back that green infrastructure in ways that buffer you from extreme events, sea level rise, nuisance flooding, et cetera? So there's a hand-in-hand sort of scenario here that has to go on. Can we achieve it? Yeah, I'm pretty optimistic. I've seen the next generation. I've got a lot of faith in their intellectual capacity.
So before I moved to Brazil at the start of 2014 to write about whatever goes on in Brazil, which is a lot, I wrote about science and technology. And the one thing you realize very quickly writing about science and technology is that a lot of the science and technology comes out of the United States. So it's been a scientific and technological powerhouse for a very, very long time. Are you afraid, Jason, are you afraid that the sort of anti-science attitude that currently pervades, what seems to pervade the White House, and the sort of anti-science rhetoric that you hear a lot, and in fact threats to cut funding for energy research and for other sort of research that would help meet the optimistic scenario that Susan has sketched. Do you worry that could prove to be a hurdle to achieve that bright future?
Sure, I worry about it. I mean, Susan can speak to this too. I mean, so Columbia University, just about a month ago, President Bollinger launched a new capital campaign, $5 billion over 5 years. Energy and climate in particular is a key pillar of that goal. And part of the conversation has been a concern about what happens if federal funding for research into various aspects of climate change declines, and to what extent philanthropy and external groups and private sector and great universities can step in to fill some of that gap. So, I mean, obviously a lot of the funding for universities comes from federal grants. So I think there is a concern about that and how to make that up. And then, as you said, just more the atmosphere and the environment in which we're having this conversation. I mean, there can and should be policy differences or differences of opinion about how you design climate policy, to what extent you use command and control regulations versus market-based approaches, to what extent, what role government has versus the private sector. But there has long been bipartisan support for the importance of energy R&D. This is something that Republicans and Democrats have long come together on, or for the need to protect the environment, even if we have different ideas about exactly what the best policies are to do that. Obviously, the EPA was created by President Nixon. I mean, we've had Clean Air Act amendments in 1990 during the administration of George H.W. Bush. So these were not deeply partisan issues in the same way they are today. And I think when we don't agree or even accept sort of the basic set of facts and science that tell us what problem we're trying to solve, that's really worrying.
Nick, I wanted to ask you, because you use a lot of research, you actually do a lot of your own research, but you also use a lot of research that comes out of the public sector or the university sector, right? Are you afraid that the government's policies might slow the flow of those ideas that would feed into your more applied research?
So I would echo some of the things that Jason was just saying, although I would say it's probably prudent if we don't. Sometimes there's a tendency to over-interpret short-term political events, and I think it's important, especially when you talk about the research and technology development space, to take a long view. Yeah. You mentioned, you asked Susan how optimistic she was about some things. I'll give a couple reasons I'm actually optimistic about some of the challenges that we face. Just yesterday, I got into town here and was spending some time at just a few blocks from here at the University of Texas, where we have an active partnership in place, a multi-year, multi-million-dollar research program with technicians and scholars and engineers at the University of Texas working on all manner of future energy programs. We have similar programs in place at other colleges and research institutions around the world. And it is impossible, I assure you, it is impossible to spend any time with the technical folks in these communities and not be optimistic about what's going on there. And these are people who are doing research projects that are looking past, one congressional cycle and one presidential administration. So I think it's important for us to remember that we are the beneficiaries of research like that, and also foster some of it. Jason sees it, I know, with his colleagues at Columbia. Susan has been doing this her entire career. So I think it's a good check for us every now and again to remember that that's going on. It's going to continue going on. I don't think there's going to be a massive swing in the United States on funding or whatnot. And Jason actually pointed out helpfully the history of this. If you look at it, the history, I think, moves in a constructive and a positive direction. So that gives me reason for optimism. I do think that really is what is essential here, which is the basic fundamental technical research that is going to have to go into technologies that can scale, because that's probably the biggest challenge when we're talking about the energy system. We're talking about something that is so big, so pervasive, not pervasive enough in some places, and so you need these enormous scalable technical and engineering solutions that are going to meet the challenge. But at least in the research community in the United States, and in Europe and elsewhere around the world, increasingly in China and India, there are lots of exciting things going on. There's a lot of optimism in that space, and it certainly gives me optimism.
There's a lot of development, obviously, of science around the world, but America really has dominated science. So when you look at the Nobel Prizes, for instance, I mean, it's just dominated science for decades. So my sort of one worry is that if the research infrastructure, which has served America so well, is allowed to deteriorate or to ramp down, it would take these new players a long time in order to develop their own research infrastructure to rival America's at present. Susan, do you worry that that's a problem, or do you think that either that the American research infrastructure is hale and hearty, or that abroad can grow faster than perhaps I feel?
Well, first of all, the data shows that in terms of percentage of R&D of what's going in the United States that's going into research has declined. It's declined over many years. It's not just and over many administrations as a percentage of GDP. So that is a worry. There are a lot of other countries that are actually investing more per GDP in their R&D program than the United States at this point. Second point to make is American science has become very international. International collaborations in the basic research environment have really expanded extensively. United States has great international collaborations with European colleagues, great international collaborations with Asia, and of course China as well. It's moving along. Australia. So there are a lot of growth, if you will, in basic research that is really international in scope. And so it's not the United States, where it once may have been the only player in this scene, on a global scene, that no longer is true. And the investment that these other countries are making, particularly some of the developing countries, is, South Korea's invested huge amounts. China is investing in huge amounts. After World War II, Japan began to invest in large amounts. So it's not just a U.S. Entity anymore. That said, losing our capability on this global scale to basically have the next generation of science come forward, the next generation of scientists, is something that definitely worries me, because I see the trends in the U.S. going down, investment in the National Science Foundation, investment in DOE basic research programs, DOD basic research programs, NOAA, NASA, earth sciences, not so much outer space, but earth sciences. A lot of that is being degraded over the years at a time when you would like to see, and what you need is more into that area.
So I would like to take a few questions from the floor now. We have a roving mic.
Julia Novi-Hildesley with Stanford University. Really interested to hear, excuse me, the panel's comments about possibly establishing a global price for carbon. We talked about the importance of policy, the importance of markets, the balance, and I was interested to hear that we did not discuss yet the establishing a price on carbon and what that would mean, and would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Could you just a quick response from each of the panelists?
I think it's the right policy is to put a price on the social cost, on the externality, and that we know the arguments about why that is and the extent to which greenhouse gases are so pervasive in different parts of the economy and how they're used, and the ability for a price signal to help us figure out what the cheapest ways would be to reduce emissions, because you often don't know that in advance, and you don't know the way in which private sector innovation will come along to find unique opportunities to lower emissions costs more cheaply than we think. And that's true with environmental regulation generally. There's a long history now when you design environmental regulation in sort of market-based approaches, you discover ways to achieve the environmental objective at lower cost than people had originally anticipated. I think it's encouraging to see a lot more discussion of a carbon price, including from some conservatives and some Republicans, and the letter that Schultz and Baker signed, and some new organizations and nonprofit groups that have sprouted up to sort of make a conservative case for a carbon tax. I still think the political outlook for that, unfortunately, seems not optimistic in the US, nevertheless coordinating one globally, which is even vastly more challenging. So I don't know that I'd bet on it anytime soon, but I do think you need the issue. I mean, right now, part of the problem is that the American people believe in climate change when you ask them, but it's not a top priority when you say, what are the top 3 or 4 issues you think about when you cast your vote? So we need work to elevate the level of urgency around this problem, build more political momentum so people think that the urgency, the pressure on policymakers is stronger than it is today to take action. And then we'll start to get to talk about what really more serious policy approaches would be. And then I think we'll be ready to have a serious conversation about a carbon tax, because many people will recognize, and many industries and businesses have, like Exxon, that it can be the most cost-effective way to address the problem.
Just to build on that a little bit, so, and the questioner, you mentioned that you were at Stanford, and if you have a chance, you can go visit with Secretary Schultz there. I recommend that you do that. He's done very interesting work in this and actually other realms if you go back and look at work that he did on other environmental issues. But one thing I think is helpful for people to keep in mind in the United States and elsewhere is that there's already a lot of policy in place at the local, state, and federal level that's designed to address what we can broadly call sort of emissions questions. The relevant question becomes, okay, is this the right way to go about doing it? I'm encouraged by the general direction that the conversation around this issue has taken over the last couple of years, in terms of talking more explicitly about a price on CO2 and other GHG emissions, sending a clear signal, and then using the power of markets and technology to drive the solutions that are the most efficient and most cost effective. So I see, this is politics and policy, so it's cumbersome and it can be frustrating and can take a while, but I'm encouraged by at least the way that the conversation is going in a much more constructive direction. And it would be one thing if we didn't have policies in place, but we do. We have them in lots of places, lots of different jurisdictions. Moving towards policy rationalization in this space, I think would be beneficial across the board.
Susan, we have a very closely related question from the app. So how do we bridge the current, obviously widening gap between carbon policies we need and the ones we have? So one such policy, one such way would be to introduce a carbon tax. Do you think that would be the optimal idea, or are there other things that we should be considering?
Well, a carbon price, I'll say. It could be a carbon tax, or it could be a cap and trade. I think the general...
Do you think one of them is preferable to another?
I would have to defer to those who are in the business area. I do think that some sort of pricing on carbon is an essential policy. I would like to say, though, and you're going to talk about this later this afternoon, with carbon goes water. Energy that you make, everything that you make is water. And as a commodity, pricing water is also a big issue that goes with this. It's not just carbon. So keep that in mind when you're thinking of the energy issue, and the scale of it is, they use a lot of water. in the production of energy. We use a lot of water, hopefully more efficiently in agriculture. And as the planet goes towards 8-9 billion people, feeding that is going to be a real easy. So the synergies, the interdependencies you hear of policies, you have to have policies that understand those interdependencies of energy, water, and food in terms of looking at sustainability in the future. I often thought that, you know, our institution, my institution was involved deeply in responding, or from a science point of view, to the Macondo oil spill on the Deepwater Horizon. And you saw oil everywhere. And you know, everyone was just, you know, that visual impact of what that did to the environment. It's unfortunate that carbon dioxide is odorless and colorless. I mean, if you could see it, and if you could see it, you might think differently about the need for a carbon price.